Hello everyone, regardless of whether or not you're watching this. If you know someone who isn't watching this, first of all, tell them to watch it, and second of all, say hello to them. Tell them I say hello. So recently there's been a lot of buzz about this one specific author slash book series that you may or may not have heard of. It's a little obscure. It's called the Grishaverse by Leigh Bardugo. Just kidding. If you spend very much time on BookTube at all, you not only probably know exactly what I'm talking about when I talk about that author and series, but you've also watched copious vines about the relationship of the protagonists in the books. But I know that sometimes people are new to things and it's kind of unfair to assume that people just know everything about something when they might not. So as a little introduction, Leigh Bardugo is the author of many different books that are almost all set in this universe called the Grishaverse. It's sort of like a facsimile of Europe, or like many parts of Europe. Most of the countries in the Grishaverse have like a certain analog to a European country. Most of the books take place in a country called Ravka, which is most similar probably to Russia out of countries in our universe, but it's obviously not completely the same. And the Grisha are people who have magical abilities who have often been mistreated by the government in these different countries. For example, in Ravka, there's like a school for Grisha that the girl in Shadow and Bone, which is like the very first book Leigh Bardugo wrote, actually attends. But in Fjerda, I think that's how you say it, Fjerda? It's like the Scandinavian analog. They're actually... being a Grisha is basically a crime, and if you're found out, then you will be imprisoned and probably killed. And the magical powers have like a lot of different components. There are people who can like summon winds and sun. There are people who can like change people's facial features to disguise them. There are people who can stop people's hearts or like make them go faster. Leigh Bardugo's written a lot of books that are set in this world. And honestly, I think it's a testament to her range and skills as a writer that so many different kinds of people love her books. People who love more literary works love her books. People who love YA fantasy love her books. People who generally don't even touch anything fantasy or YA also love her books. And I think that that's because they are pretty well written. She's pretty good at driving a story forward, even though occasionally her plots are a little... Okay, I'm gonna get to that. And of course, her characters are, for the most part, really, really excellent. So to celebrate the fact that a TV show is being made out of Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows, and that Leigh Bardugo has a new book in the Grishaverse coming out soon, I am going to go through all of the books of hers that I've read, which is almost all of them. I haven't read the new one yet. And I'm going to talk about which ones I think are the best, which ones I think you should start with, and just general feelings that I have about all of them. I'm going to rank these from the ones I like the least / had the least impact on me and the ones that I thought were the best. And so at the very bottom of this, I'm gonna have to say the original Grisha Trilogy. These books, which start with Shadow and Bone, and then there's two more, what's the second one? Oh my god. Siege and Storm. It's 2 S's. Siege and Storm and Ruin and Rising. These 3 books were the first books that Leigh Bardugo wrote. They came out, I would say, when I was in like early high school, and that's around the time I read them. They're kind of, in a lot of ways, are kind of typical like YA fantasy. They star a protagonist named Alina Starkov who doesn't have any family, isn't exceptional in any way whatsoever, isn't pretty at all, except every man in the book is in love with her, but you know what? Let's just move on from that. And seems to be extremely ordinary until it's discovered that she has incredible power that nobody knew about, and so she's taken to be trained as a Grisha. And of course, there's something more nefarious at work. She has to save the world, yada yada yada. I really loved these books when I first read them, which was, oh my gosh, like 6-7 years ago? I don't even know. And they were sort of my gateway into young adult fantasy and young adult books in general. I was one of those kids who really didn't want to grow up, and so I stayed down in the middle grade shelves of the library absolutely as long as I could. It also helps that since I've been about 15, I've looked like I was 12, so nobody really thought twice about somebody who looked like me going through middle grade books. But these books taught me that young adult fantasy could also be really exciting and cool, and so I'm kind of grateful to them for that. I like a lot of the world building of Ravka, of the Grisha. I like several of the side characters in these books, many of whom come back later in later books. I have not touched these books in a very long time, and I think if I were to pick them up now, I would not be the hugest fan of them, because I honestly don't remember anything about Elena other than she's like as regular as you can get. So she didn't really stand out to me. There's also this guy called the Darkling who sort of runs like the Grisha institution as far as I remember, and he becomes like a much more powerful force in the book as the books go on. And I remember thinking he was like really interesting and complex like at the time that I read the books, but I feel like if I read it now I'd be like pfft. So putting them at the bottom of the list doesn't mean I dislike them. It doesn't mean that they don't mean a lot to me. It just means that everything that came after them is so much better. Although chronologically these books come before all the other Grishaverse books, I don't know if I would recommend that you read them first. I almost feel like they would make for good background reading if you get really into the other books, but if you're someone who's just starting out and wants something a bit more mature than like a typical young adult fantasy where the protagonist is not like other girls but also like exactly like other girls somehow, I really don't think that you need the information in these books to read the other books. I would put them, all three of them, pretty much on the same level. Oh wait, actually Shadow and Bone I would put a little bit lower, because in the next two books, my favorite side character in these series, Nikolai Lantsov, my beloved husband, he shows up in book 2, and he's probably the most interesting part about any of these books. So book 1 is like a little bit below, and then the next two books are sort of like up here. Just above the original Grisha Trilogy, we have the most recent installment in this universe of books, and that is King of Scars. Now, you know how I just mentioned that Nikolai Lantsov is my husband? Well, this book is mainly about him, or at least it was supposed to be. There's going to be some slight spoilers here if you haven't read the first 3 books, but honestly I just told you not to, so I'm going to go ahead and say it. Nikolai is the king of Ravka. He's quite young, and he spent a lot of his adolescence like moonlighting as this pirate guy named Sturmhond, I think. And he like goes around and like does deals with people. And he's very witty and down to earth and smart and just all around good at lots of things, but somehow not annoying about it. Most of the best one-liners in the original trilogy are his. And this book I was super excited for because I thought it was going to be all about him, except he has to share it with 3 other people. I'm not bitter. Why would I be bitter? There are 3 other point of view characters in this book. One of them is from the original Grisha Trilogy, another is a major character from the Six of Crows duology, and the third one doesn't come in until later, and they are a totally new character that we haven't met. I enjoyed reading this book. I liked spending a little bit more time with Nikolai as he navigates what it's like to be king as a young man and all the court intrigue, and also resolving some problems that had come up in previous books as well, which I won't mention because I don't want to spoil anything for you, depending on where you decide to start. And his character definitely did not disappoint me here. I also liked the brand new character. I thought he was a really good and interesting addition to the book. The Six of Crows character, Nina, I did like her here. I thought that her character development was pretty good, but I thought that she made some weird jumps, I suppose, with where her development was from the previous books, and so that was a little jarring for me. I also think that this book suffers a bit from what I think is Leigh Bardugo's biggest flaw, and that is that her plots take a while to move forward, and sometimes that's due to setting up world building, but oftentimes it's due to, it just seems like her not really knowing where the story is going to go. So occasionally there was a lot of like sitting around in this book that I didn't really understand or want to see. But despite that, I did enjoy it. I do think the ending, though it was kind of a cliffhanger, it made me excited to read the next book, which is the one that's coming out soon. And so if I were to put a star rating on this, it would probably be like, I don't know, like 3.5 or something. I thought it was pretty good, and I'm excited to read the next one. So back to my ranking, a little bit above King of Scars on this list is going to be the only book I've read by Leigh Bardugo that isn't in the Grishaverse, and that is Ninth House. If you've been watching my channel for a while, then you might have seen my December book wrap-up back in 2020 when I talked about having read Ninth House and my thoughts on it. So I'm going to put a link to that wrap-up in here, so if you want a more detailed description of Ninth House, you can go there. I think that this, yet again, shows Leigh Bardugo's talents in that she chose to do something that's very, very different from the Grisha Trilogy. It's an urban fantasy, so it's set in our world. It's set at Yale University, where Leigh Bardugo actually attended, and you can tell by the descriptions of the university and life there that she remembers it well, and she knows a lot of insider details about it. The book is about this girl named Alex Stern, who can see ghosts and has been able to for her entire life, and that has sent her down a really difficult path and has led a lot of people in her life to not understand her or trust her, and so life has been very difficult for her. But she gets recruited by a secret society at Yale to attend school there and work for them with some of their paranormal activities. In real life, there are actually 8 houses at Yale that aren't really fraternities, but sort of operate in that same way. They're like secret societies. And in this book, the 9th house, which is the one that Alex is part of, is the house that oversees all of those houses. And they're all doing magic and working with ghosts, which is where Alex comes in. I thought the world building here was really excellent. I loved all of the different societies and their different characters. I liked Alex as a character, although she isn't always likable per se. I thought that exploring her path and where she'd been was really interesting, and it made me understand the decisions she made much better knowing that. This is also probably the closest thing Leigh Bardugo has written to a murder mystery, and so that aspect of it was really interesting to see a murder mystery but in more of a fantasy setting. I would give it a 4 out of 5 because sometimes the world building did bog down the book a little bit, but I still really enjoyed it a lot more than I expected to. And this is definitely not a young adult book. It ventures a lot more into adult fantasy territory than any of her other books, but I would still really recommend it if that's what you're looking for. Next up, we have the one, the only, Six of Crows. I don't even know what's left to say about Six of Crows. Everybody and their mother has been talking about it and why they love it and why Kaz Brucker is their fiance. He's my fiance too. Don't worry. But if you somehow haven't heard about it, this book is about 6 teenagers who all act much older than teenagers, but we'll just put that aside for a minute. And they all live in the city of Ketterdam, sort of form a band of con men. They all have really rough backstories, and you learn more about them as the book goes on, but they're just this crew of people who are trying to survive in a world that doesn't really want them to. And the main plot of the book is when they get this major job to pull off a heist of international significance. Now, I'm not going to mention very much about the heist because, to be honest, I don't remember a lot about it, and that's kind of not the most important part of the book, in my opinion. Of course, it's important, and I think that people who enjoy a fast-paced heist story might also like this book, but this book is also really more heavy on the characters and their development. And sometimes the heist almost gets forgotten about in the midst of all of these characters interacting with each other and sort of coming to terms with their very difficult histories. But it's incredibly worth it because these are some of the best characters that I have seen in young adult literature. Kaz Brucker is probably the most prominent of these characters. He's the front man of this group. And he's one of those people who's, very damaged and pushes people away, but has kind of a soft heart if you dig down deep enough. Other characters include Inej, who is a girl who was rescued from a brothel, and she used to work in a circus with her family, so she's very good at sneaking into buildings, and she in a lot of ways is sort of the moral center of this group. Nina, who I mentioned earlier, who's in King of Scars, is also in this group, and she's very funny and wisecracking, and she has Grisha abilities, so she brings that. And then there's a few others too. This is probably where I would tell somebody to start with Leigh Bardugo. This book has a pretty high success rate with the people I know who have read it. They all really like the characters, they're into the story. The world building is pretty easy to grasp onto, although it does take a while. So this is where I think you should start if you're watching this. And just a little bit higher than Six of Crows, we have Six of Crows sequel, which is Crooked Kingdom. I kind of respect Leigh Bardugo for choosing to make this a duology rather than a trilogy, as much as I would have loved to have 3 books about these characters. I know that there's a lot of push to make something 3 books, so because that's sort of what people expect with fantasy, and also because I think and also because people just want to sell more books, but Leigh Bardugo decided she wanted to conclude the story here, and I thought that that made a lot of sense. Even though this book does have a little bit of that slowness going on that I think is characteristic of Leigh Bardugo's books, I still really, really loved it. It continues the development of all of these characters, but takes it to the next level, I think, in a lot of ways, and they grow both as a group and also individually. And so that's really great to see. I don't remember a ton about the plot details in this book. I do know that I think this book is a little bit more focused on character development than Six of Crows even was, but I'm into that kind of thing, so I really liked that. And even though every character doesn't necessarily get like a pat, tied up, perfect ending, you have this feeling that their stories are to an extent resolved, even though they do continue in later volumes, especially Nina. But I was satisfied with the place that everybody was in by the end of the book. But honestly, the real reason I just had to put this above Six of Crows was the bandage scene. And if you know, you know. Honestly though, even with all of that stuff that's going on, even with these stellar characters and this amazing scene that I actually think about all the time, not kidding, like I think about it like once a week minimum, and this really interesting world, this book is still not the best book that Leigh Bardugo has written, because that book is The Language of Thorns. This book is stunning. I feel like out of all of Leigh Bardugo's books, this is the one that is the most criminally underrated. I think most people read Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom and they get really into it and they love it, and I totally understand that because of the reasons that I've just shared with you, but not all of them find out about The Language of Thorns, and if they find out about it, they don't necessarily pick it up, and that is a darn shame. The Language of Thorns is a collection of Leigh Bardugo's short stories that are supposedly fairy tales from the different countries that she mentions in the Grishaverse. There are 6 of them, and most of them were initially published separately, but she decided to collect them together in this volume. As you can see, there are 6 of them here. One of them is Zemeni, 3 of them are Ravkin, there's a Fjerdan story, there's a Kirch story. These stories are honestly show-stopping in so many ways. First of all, short stories are really, really difficult to write. They're usually where authors get their start before they start publishing novels, and they are much shorter, but if you think about everything that has to happen in such a short space in order to make a successful short story, that's kind of crazy. It's honestly really hard to write a really good, snappy, concise short story that sticks with people. And every single one of these, all 6 of them, are memorable. They are fascinating. They have a clever twist on the story that they're based on. There are takes in here on Beauty and the Beast, on witches that live in the woods, on The Little Mermaid, on the Nutcracker even, and they're also complex, and they manage to take you to a place that you never thought you would go within this story, even though you might have read lots of versions of these. The writing is beautiful. Many of the characters manage to stand out, which is also difficult to do in a short story. Also, the amount of just care that was put into these stories and also the design of the book is just extraordinary. The stories are told in either red or blue ink. You can see here, Ayama and the Thornwood. It's told in red ink, and there's a little bit of an illustration up here in the corner. And something that's really cool is when you every time you turn the page, you start to see a little bit added on to the illustration. There's a little bit more here. And you see there's even more. It starts to be on the other side. More. You know what? Here. This isn't working. Okay. Okay, so here's a little bit of a better shot of the language of Thorns. The book is told in either red or blue ink, depending on the story. You can see with this one, Ayama and the Thornwood, which is the Zemini tale. It starts out with red ink, and there's also a little illustration of a castle up here. But the really cool thing about this collection is that every time you turn the page, the illustration adds a detail while maintaining the original one from the previous page. And then you turn again, you see it's a little bit different. And then again, and again, and then you start getting stuff on the sides too. And that just keeps continuing until you get to the very end when you get something like this. Do you see that? Do you see that? Are you looking at this right now? Why is no one talking about this? Why? Why is everybody talking about frickin' Six of Crows when they have this right here? I understand. I get it. Kaz Brecker is your fiance. I know. He's my fiance too. But come on. This is one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. Please talk about it. Read it. Talk about it more. Read it more. Anyway, now that I've calmed down a little bit, that concludes my summary of the works of Leigh Bardugo. And at the end here, I'm going to make a prediction of where I think the new book, Rule of Wolves, is going to go in my ranking. This is the sequel to King of Scars, and I'm probably going to be reading it in the next couple of months. And I think that it has the potential to be better than King of Scars, but I don't know if it has the potential to be better than Six of Crows. So I'm going to say it goes right above no. That's not what I said at all. I'm going to say it goes right above King of Scars, right below Six of Crows in my Leigh Bardugo ranking. So I will read it and let you know if that is the case. Thanks for joining me as I ramble my way through Leigh Bardugo's books. She does a much better job of writing them than I do of talking about them, so I highly recommend that you pick them up and see for yourself. Thanks everybody, and hope you have a good day/week.